Detroit, Michigan. We're very, very sorry. He is the minister of the Dresden Church of Christ in Dresden, Tennessee. He's a graduate of the Memphis School of Preaching and received a BA and an MA from Amridge University. Skip has taught for the Georgia School of Preaching and for the Bear Valley Extension School of Preaching. He and his wife Helen are the parents of one daughter and one son, and they have 5 grandchildren. Skip has been a friend of mine for about 35 years as well. He has married his wonderful wife Helen, who is from this area, and her 2 sisters are at our lectureship about every year, if not at every session, I believe they might be. He has wonderful children. I had the privilege of watching them grow up about a week at a time throughout the years. And Skip is one of the most humble people that I know. He always gives the credit and the glory to God. He really desperately wants people to be saved. And you can see that in his preaching and in his life. Skip?
We'll be studying Psalm 9, God Gives Me Loyalty. Before I came up here, Helen said, "You can do it, sweetie." In 2003, our son sent us to fantasy camp of the Tigers in Lakeland, Florida. And I told him I'd like that to be my annual mission trip. It's cheaper than a lot of mission trips. But anyway, he has not accommodated me on that. But anyway, every time I came up to bat, she was in the stands hollering, "You can do it, sweetie." And I forget, one lady next to her called me something else, but it wasn't sweetie. But on the last day of the camp, there's a game at Joker Marchant Field, and the catcher for the Tigers, former Tigers team, was Tom Brookins, and then there was an umpire behind him, and they had, Brookins is from Pennsylvania, and he and Helen had been after each other all week with West Virginia and Pennsylvania jokes and stuff like that. But anyway, I told him and the umpire, I said, if she hollers, "You can do it, sweetie," run back to the fence and holler, "Shut up, Helen." So she did it, and they did it. So it's a lot of fun, and I'm not a person who speaks very often away from home. I did have a meeting a few weeks ago in a town near to us that if you live there, you pronounce it Parmal. If you read it, it says Palmersville. But anyway, I did have a meeting there this year. Like I said, I don't speak away from home too often, but I am happy to have this opportunity. I want to begin with a poem, and it's from Isaac Watts, who wrote hundreds of poems about the Psalms, and many of them we sing, and he was truly a marvelous writer, at least. "With my whole heart I'll raise my song, thy wonders I'll proclaim. Thou sovereign judge of right and wrong wilt put my foes to shame. I'll sing thy majesty and grace. My God prepares his throne to judge the world in righteousness and make his vengeance known. Then shall the Lord a refuge prove for all the poor oppressed, to save the people of his love and give the weary rest. The men who know thy name will trust in thy abundant grace, for thou hast ne'er forsook the just who humbly seek thy face. Sing praises to the righteous Lord, who dwells on Zion's hill, who executes this threatening word, and doth his grace fulfill." I have a couple books by him, and I have a shelf about 8 or 12 feet long with some of my commentaries on the Psalms, trying to finish up all 150 lessons. I have at least one sermon on every psalm, and when I got this assignment, I thought, well, that won't be hard. I'll just go to my file on Psalm 9 and tweak it a little bit, and then I found out that you can approach every psalm in more than one way, and this lectureship doesn't approach it my way, so I had to come up with an entirely new lesson on Psalm 9, and it was worth the work. At least by the time I got done, I felt like it was worth the work. In Duluth, Georgia, in the late 90s, we began a class, optional class, on Psalms on Wednesday night in the church library, and it was intended to be pretty intense and personal. And so over the years, we had people come in for a week or two or 3 or 4 and not stay, but a bunch, 6, 8, 10, 12 stayed the whole time. And we worked through the entire book of Psalms on an incredibly, I think, detailed basis, including 20-some on Psalm 119. And that's one reason why I have at least one sermon on every psalm. And it truly does need to be studied more than it is. And I hope that this lectureship and the books that come from it will be the very things that accomplish that goal of helping us to see how much we need this book. It is used all through the New Testament. And that should be enough to convince us that we need to use it. And when the Bible uses itself, it's not just saying, well, that's all we can do with that. It's showing us how to use the rest that isn't used that way. Much of the Psalms are connected with the New Testament only by our learning how to do that. It's like Jesus with the parables. How many parables did Jesus explain? Well, very few. Well, how do we explain the others? We learn how to do it from those. So if we see Psalm 110 quoted in Acts 2, then we learn from that how to use other psalms and see how valuable they would all be for us. So I hope, again, among other things, that kind of thing occurs as a result of this study you're going to be doing. When I used this lesson at home to see how it would float, I put a new introduction on it, and this is it. Loyalty is everywhere. Often undeserved, often misdirected, often misunderstood, and often very powerful. A fan. Win, lose, or draw, I'm in my seat. I root for the Tigers, the Pistons, the Lions, the Red Wings, and the Wolverines, and it does not matter who's on the team or how good they are. I'm loyal. My dad taught me that. He also taught me that no self-respecting Detroiter ever cheers from any team from Chicago. So you just learn various things about loyalty. Now, some of that doesn't matter a lot. However, there is a principle about loyalty, that loyalty is no matter what, if it's your team, if it's your town, if it's something like that, then you see some value from it. A pet, often mistreated, with tail wagging, will go to the very one that's doing it harm, maybe to give another chance. Loyalty, misguided, but it's obvious. A child, repeatedly abused, will often run to the very person, whoever that might be, especially a parent, who's the guilty party. Again, using the word abuse in a variety of ways. Things that we do. We go back to husband and wife. A husband or wife can be the object of ridicule, scorn, and sin, and welcome the other party home again with open arms to try again. And most of us are grateful that there are people like that will let us try again, that will give us another chance, that will be loyal to us, not just because things are going okay, but because loyalty matters, and loyalty can undo some things that are not good. And then we have a God, the God. How many of us ever thought that we live in a world, a country, a state, a county, or a little town where we have to tell people who God is? But we do. How many people in Moundsville, West Virginia, know who God is today? We would probably be utterly shocked if we were to give them an essay and say, tell us who God is, and see what the answers would be, based upon maybe the same thing 30 or 40 years ago in the same place. So God is loyal to us. We give him the scraps of our lives, and yet he waits with the blood of his Son to cleanse me every time I come on his terms. And I leave cleansed. And I don't have to wait for him to show up. God is loyal. And so when we talk about loyalty, we're beginning a psalm where he says at the beginning of it, here's my decision. The psalm begins with what I'm calling his decision. I will 4 times. I will praise thee, O Lord, with my whole heart. I will show forth all thy marvelous works. I will be glad and rejoice in thee. I will sing praise to thy name, O thou most high. One of the things that we can learn from the Psalms or anything else in the Bible is some of the simple terms. Study or do a sermon on every place the word I will is found in Psalm 119, for example. Somebody mentioned a moment ago, I think it was Eddie, about the question, how long? In our class in Psalms in Duluth, we found that the question, how long, is in the Psalms 60 times, at least. So somebody's been asking that for a while, haven't they? And God gives answers. So he says, I will. When we talk about the I wills of these 2 verses, we go with a little explanation of each one. I will start from my heart. That is, this is an emotion. This man who wrote the psalm, David, is wanting God to know, and whoever reads this, I'm involved in my decision to be loyal. And it starts with my heart because I love you. And I've been taught by my mom and dad from Deuteronomy 6, David might say, that that's where it all begins. Listen and love. Hear, O Israel, love the Lord thy God with all. Whatever we are made of, it should all be devoted to loving God. I will tell of your marvelous works. And in this psalm, we can begin by looking at the marvelous works that are in this psalm. That's what he's telling about, those works. But there are many other works of God that we could go to that are not in Psalm 9. But in that one, there's enough to show why he would say, I'm going to tell about it. And he says, I will be happy and jubilant in you. And that is, this happiness and jubilation is as a result of his relationship with God, which is impossible without knowing God, which means we have to know his character, which is what the book of Psalms is about. I will sing praises to thy name. The word name is found 104 times in the Psalms, and almost every one of them is a reference to God's name, and a lot of them don't give a name, it just says name. Trying to help us understand that the name of God is significant, and the one he uses here is O Most High. If we think about our need to be loyal to God, we think of that which is number 1 in our list. Now, I am semi-loyal to the Pirates. They're in a different league, really. They're in a different league. And they're also, if the Tigers get beat, then I'll cheer for the Pirates. I'll cheer for the Mountaineers, as long as they don't play Michigan, But the number 1 is O Most High. You don't get higher than that. His loyalty is to God, and he uses the word name, and then he says O Most High, because that is as high as he can think. Even Jesus said, I came here to do somebody else's will. I'm here not for you to just look at me, but see him through me. See him. And that is what we're talking about. We're talking about the ultimate loyalty with reference to what God gives us. He gives us what we're going to talk about here as bases for loyalty. I'm going to give 5 of them. I thought about doing this PowerPoint like a baseball field, which has 5 bases. Home, first, second, third, and pitcher's plate, as the rule book calls it. I always thought that was kind of a silly thing to call it, but it does. But then I thought maybe it might be a little too much baseball. So I just went with the 5 paragraphs in the psalm as each being one of our bases for loyalty. And let me make the point that each one of these is sufficient by itself for me to decide to be loyal to God come what may. All 5 together is far more evident, the Hebrew writer might say, that he deserves our loyalty. But each one is sufficient, so that maybe point 1, you say, well, I see, but I'm not 100%. Well, let's go to point 2. And finally, one of them clicks. Yes, I will be. So depending on who we are, where we're living in our lives, and what's happened to us, a base may not be as appealing right now to you as another one. But they're all valid, whether we get it at the same time and place or not. So in verses 3 to 5, he says, you maintain my cause. So I'm going to read these paragraphs as I come to them and then talk a little bit about each one. When mine enemies are turned back, they shall fall and perish at thy presence. For thou hast maintained my right and my cause. Thou hast sattest in the throne, judging right. Thou hast rebuked the heathen. Thou hast destroyed the wicked. Thou hast put out their name forever and ever. So verse 3 will happen, he says, because verses 4 and 5 have happened. He's confident about now and later because of what he can see has already taken place. Verse 3 is, when mine enemies are turned back, they shall fall and perish at thy presence. I am totally confident that this is going to happen. And he knows that because he's experienced something similar one or more times already in his life. And if you think about what's happening here, he uses 3 things, and you can see the progression. First of all, the enemy goes back, then the enemy falls, and then the enemy perishes. I think I have a note in the book about comparing this to Goliath. I have 20-some lessons on this Goliath thing, and it's just amazing to see how much is in that story. But for 40 days and 40 nights, if you please, 80 times Goliath came out to an army that got itself ready for battle morning and night 40 times, and then he challenged them, and they all went back to their tents and cried like babies. And David comes along, probably a teenager, and says, isn't there a cause? Isn't there a cause? And Goliath, before you know it, went back, down, and done. That's what he's saying is going to happen. I don't know what he had in mind here, any particular event, maybe that one, but he's confident that that's going to happen to whatever is happening now or next because he knows what God has already done. Just in his own life, not to mention what he has done all the way up to Psalm 9 in history. So he's totally confident of that because of that particular situation. So then he says, and I think this is very interesting, and I tried to look up and see all the different words here as to what connections they might have and whether they had any meaning that might be somewhat useful for us. And the word presence in the King James at verse 3, the last word in the verse, means face. And it's amazing to think about the character of God, that in every person's life who's sitting here today, there's something going on. Lots of things going on. At least one thing is probably something is a struggle of some sort. And there's 7.3 billion of us on earth, and we all have one or more of those. And God is able to face every last one of them at the same time, and everything that's causing that at the same time, and deal with it all at the same time. Now, is that not God Most High or not? And so he says, of course I know, because of your presence, because of your face. You are facing me and my whatever this is, and I know it's going to be taken care of because it's been done before, 1 or 100 times before. Just for me, it's been done. And he's totally aware of that, totally confident in that. And so today, this same base, this base is for us, for me, because today the base is the same. That has to do with God will maintain your cause. And since it's the same, the outcome will be the same. Romans 8, 28 to 39. Paul clearly guarantees that. If you do what God says for you to do, as one who loves him, verse 28, the outcome is certain. Now, we may not know the details of the outcome, how much more we're going to suffer, how long it's going to be, and all of that, but we know the outcome. If God be for us, who shall be against us? Then we go to number 2 in verses 6 through 8. He says, O thou enemy, destructions are come to a perpetual end. And thou hast destroyed cities, their memorial is perished with them, but the Lord shall endure forever. He hath prepared his throne for judgment, and he shall judge the world in righteousness. He shall minister judgment to the people in uprightness. So verses 6 through 8, he's saying to God, you abide forever. Now maybe that is something we've heard so often that we fail to see sometimes how important it is to know that he abides forever. So focusing on that a little bit and going in, and I haven't done this, but the forever verses or words that are all through the Psalms and even the whole Bible, there's something about that matters. It should make a difference to us. And that God is the one who is forever, that is forever in every direction. You and I are going to be forever. But we had a beginning. He didn't. His goings forth are from of old, from everlasting. Micah 5:2, Psalm 90, verses 1 and 2. And so he is forever. The contrast then is between the enemy of verse 6 and Jehovah in verses 7 and 8. The enemy in verse 6 is one who has destructions. They are come to a perpetual end. They are going to fall. They are going to be dealt with, and it is going to continue to be dealt with. It is not going to come back. God is going to deal with this in a forever kind of fashion. At some point, some way, sometime, all of it is going to be dealt with. Some of it will be dealt with sooner than later, of course. And some of it will not be dealt with on our terms or timetable at all, but it will be dealt with. And so, if you look at the language in this verse 6, thou hast destroyed cities. Their memorial is perished with them. Sometimes I think when archaeologists spend their whole time digging in the dumps of ancient cities, if they ever realize that a trash pile does not necessarily represent what was going on in the city. They think it does, but it could be very different from that, because they may have been people who conserved all the good stuff and reused it. And the trash pile really was trash. We do not know anywhere near as much about what used to be as we like to think we know. There are things that are gone for good. I don't know about you, but I have for a long time been thankful to God that we do not have a long documented history of the pre-flood world. How bad can you get if you live for 900 years? How evil could you be? And we'll look how good Noah was. Look how good Enoch was. So how bad were the bad people? I'm glad we don't have that information. So God has dealt with that. Some of it we're not going to get to know because we don't need to know it. Some of it has been done in such a way as to help us understand that God is forever and none of this other is forever. It's nothing to be counted on. It's nothing to be relied upon. You would think these people that want to rule the world would eventually see that most people who want to rule the world only get to try for 10 or 15 years anyway before they die in some war. And even if they live to be a ripe old age of 70, so what? God is forever. None of the things that we do. God is unchangeable. The psalm before this begins and ends, O Lord, our Lord, how excellent is thy name in all the earth. God is unchangeable. He's that way then, he's that way now. Now, the world today is doing a pitiful job of saying how excellent his name is, but it is anyway. And it needs to be said more and more by people who love him and keep his commandments. He is the judge. Acts 17:31 has a phrase just like that he is going to judge the world in righteousness. Now, whether that was a temporary kind of judgment there that the poet was talking about or not really isn't the point. The point is that whenever God judges the world, how does he do it? He does it correctly. He does it by a standard that is revealed and knowable. We can know how God is going to judge the world in the last day, even if it's today. And this psalmist could know how God would go about judging the evil of that day. Not the details, maybe the particulars of a judgment, but he could know that when he did, it would be done exactly the way it should be. God is right. He is upright. He is righteous. And I'm sure we know that that's all the same kind of thing. The word upright here, according to one dictionary, is a word that is always plural in the Old Testament. The uprightnesses of God. So when he does something that is a matter of discerning right from wrong, deciding what should happen to both parties, it's done uprightly because everything he does is an uprightness. 1,000 times, 2 million times, 7.3 billion times, it's always done in uprightness, which does not make him some sort of an arbitrary judge, because look at what he wants for us. In Deuteronomy 5:29, which is the second lesson in Deuteronomy, the first one ends at about 4:44. So here, fairly close to the beginning of the second lesson, Moses says about God, he says, "Oh, that were such an heart in them, that they would fear me and keep all my commandments always, that it might be well with them and with their children forever." I have no way of knowing how God feels as God to look down on this planet today and say, here's how I feel about this. What did God want when that last baby was born? 130 million babies are going to be born this year. 130 million. 1.3 billion people on earth today are less than 10 years old. How does God feel about that? What does he want for them? Well, we know what he wants for them because we just read it, didn't we? That's what he wants. Well, what does he get? And why is he getting so little of that? Well, obviously, we bear part of the responsibility for how it is and a lot of the responsibility for how it's going to be, whether we like that or not. The fact that the Muslims don't want us in their country does not mean we don't have to go, does it? My friend Bobby Wood from Alabama would say, nod your head like this. Nothing relieves us of our obligation to teach the children. Nothing. So why don't we just do it? Today, the base that God abides forever is the same, and so will be the outcome. That is, that God is right. The word righteous, the Greek word, appears 74 times in Romans. 8 of those times it's on the negative, the unrighteous, 66 on the positive. Romans 3:24 to 26, it's actually several times, and it's God's desire to be our justifier, and it's done through Jesus, who died and shed his blood for us. This is God's desire. He still wants that for us. He still stands there with that ability to cleanse souls from sin. A few weeks ago, I was doing some chatting back and forth with Ed Jones from Knoxville on Facebook as he was saying a number of things about the life of Christ, which if you're not on his Facebook, if you're not friends with Ed, you need to become friends with him and read what he says. He can say a lot of, in 8 or 10 or 12 or 15 words, he can say some pretty profound things. Then we got to thinking about the life of Christ. He said something about reading the life of Christ, and he said a couple things that challenged me. And one was, he says, if you want to read the life of Christ and hear it in a unique way, get the audio by Johnny Cash. So I did, and it's pretty powerful. And then I decided that I was going to start reading it myself. So I decided I would read the life of Christ every week for the rest of the year, starting the last week in August. So I'm on the 9th or 10th of those now, reading Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John every week. And different version. A couple of weeks ago, I told the church I was going to read it backwards that week, and I did. Started John 21:25 with a bookmark and just went up the page. Guess what? Learned a lot. I thought I would, but I did. The life of Christ, we need it. We need it a lot. And if you read it every week for the rest of this year, which would be 8 or 9 more weeks, you will find that out. Force your eyes to keep moving. 13 chapters a day for 5 days, 12 chapters on Friday and Saturday, and you're done. 155 pages in the New Testament in this. A week? Well, of course you can do that. 155 pages, who couldn't do that? We have a granddaughter who's read more than that in 3 or 4 novels since we got here. She's 8 years old, and she's reading high school stuff. Well, this is for children, too. We can read this. We need to know the basis of loyalty has to do with who God is, that he abides. Number 3, you are a refuge. In verses 9 and 10 of Psalm 9, he says, the Lord also will be a refuge for the oppressed, a refuge in times of trouble, and they that know thy name will put their trust in thee. For thou, Lord, hast not forsaken them that seek thee. The word here, refuge, means stronghold, high tower, fort, or rock, for those who have been crushed. And go over another page or two, Psalm 11:1, and you see an illustration of it. Sometimes whatever happens to me makes me feel crushed, whatever that might be. God is my refuge in every one of those times. And that moves me up as I travel toward the refuge I'm going up. Will I choose to know? That word is used over 800 times in the Old Testament in a variety of ways, from learning simple facts to getting the profound understanding of how those facts interrelate. And while we travel that path of knowing more and more and more, we get more and more information about the name. 104 times just in Psalms. The name of God. It tells me about his character. In Hebrews 1:1-3, the writer tells us that Jesus is the express image of God. The Greek word is character. The character of God is seen in the life of Christ. The character of God has components. Compassion, love, mercy, kindness, vengeance, and all of that. And we need to know that. And the more we learn the facts, the more we understand how wonderful his character is and why he has so many capabilities that it's impossible for God to lose. His strength and tender mercies. Again, those are themes all the way through the Psalms. And his omnipresence. He is not going to leave me. He is not going to leave me. Think about your marriage. If the Lord comes while you're both alive, neither one of you will be left alone. Otherwise, there's a real good chance one of us will be alone. That's not going to be fun for the person left behind. God will not have gone anywhere. we can get through whatever crushes us if we understand God. And so this base is the same, and nothing I learn about God will lead me to renounce my loyalty. In Deuteronomy 1:27 and 4:37, which is part of the first speech in Deuteronomy, Moses quotes the fathers from the first generation, 1:27, and says, "Your fathers said God brought us out here because he hated us." They saw all the things that God did in Egypt and leading them out through the Red Sea, got to the other side, looked at the promised land and said, God hated us. They saw the reality of who God is, and that was their conclusion. That conclusion is always wrong. And so in 4:37, near the end of the sermon, Moses tells the second generation who have just watched mommy and daddy and granny and grandpa die in the wilderness for unbelief, he tells them, don't forget, God loved your fathers and you too. And he talks about that. And so that is still the same. If I renounce my loyalty to God, it's because I've come to a very bad conclusion. No conclusion. There's no good argument against God. There may be one that convinces people. That does not make it a good argument. Number 4, in verses 11 through 16, he says, you dwell among us. Sing praises to the Lord which dwelleth in Zion. Declare among the people his doings. When he maketh inquisition for blood, he remembereth them. He forgetteth not the cry of the humble. Have mercy upon me, O Lord. Consider my trouble which I suffer of them that hate me. Thou that liftest me up from the gates of death, that I may show forth all thy praise in the gates of the daughter of Zion. I will rejoice in thy salvation. The heathen are sunk down in the pit that they made. In the net which they hid is their own foot taken. The Lord is known by the judgment which he executeth. The wicked is snared in the work of his own hands. Higgaion Selah. So in those verses, 11 to 16, the psalmist tells us your presence is a window to your character. Since God's presence is here, and I can know it through what the Bible says, I can see his character through his presence. I can see it through his power. I can see it through all the other characteristics. I can see something about him that I need right here, right now. And one of those things is his presence. He's not leaving David alone in this situation. So all these terms, Zion, deeds, avenges, remember, not forget, all of that. I think it's interesting he says that God remembers and does not forget. And that is true. The application of the presence of God in two ways, in 13 through 16, positively in 13 and 14, we get access to mercy, the access to God's consideration, considering of our situation. We all go home tonight. We all get down on our knees at the same time. We all pray to God to consider a problem that we have, and every one of us has a different problem, and that is not the least bit of a problem for God. Again, I just can't stop thinking about how able he is. And that I need that. I need to know that. I need to know that when I come to God, no matter who else is in line, maybe there's not a line, he's able. I have access. No matter who else has access at the same moment. And then negatively, there's a law of sowing and reaping. We studied Proverbs a while back at Dresden, a chapter a week in Bible class, and you can't go through more than 2 or 3 verses anywhere in Proverbs without running into this law, the law of sowing and reaping. We need more and more lessons and studies about all these things, but that one is surely important in today's world. We are going to reap as we sow. We don't seem to think that is true anymore. And then this base is the same, and I can operate from it. That is Higgaion, having to do with meditation and praise, apparently. Selah has to do with the pause, possibly. And I can stop, and I can choose to give God what he deserves in this situation, which is what Hebrews 13 says we ought to do. Let us remember to give him the sacrifice of our lips. We need to be willing to do that as well as they were being told to do it. And then the last thing, as far as the paragraphs, fifth, you are our hope. In 17 and 18, the wicked shall be turned into hell, and all the nations that forget God. For the needy shall not always be forgotten. The expectation of the poor shall not perish forever. So in these verses, he tells us that there is an expectation. This is one of those surprise word studies. I looked it up, and the word expectation is the same word as the word cord that Rahab let down in the book of Joshua. And that cord was her expectation of deliverance. That was her hope. Faith is the substance of what? Everybody. Things hoped for. She believed, and she did something because she had hope, and she expected that. How many other people in that town let one of those down that day? Nobody. They didn't have any faith. What's the point of the cord? Why is there a reason to have hope if we don't have any faith? So she did it. The wicked nations, look at us today, and that includes us. You know, the only real nation on earth today is the church. And the rest of them really need help, including the United States. Where has faith gone? It's no wonder we have no hope and no trust. It's no wonder we are so mean today. It's no wonder that we are like we are. The one who is sitting is the kind of like one of the themes of this song, will judge right. He will do what needs to be done. So you go back to that chord, and you see that that's what this psalmist is saying. I have one of those because I believe. And I'm confident that this is going to turn out right. Well, that is obviously the same base today, because the exact very same thing is used in Hebrews 11, where Rahab has moved over to the New Testament to remind us of the power of that hope. And so that leads us to our